Late autumn, 1945. A concrete bunker beneath the shattered ruins of the Reichsluftfahrtministerium in Berlin. The air hangs thick with dust and defeat. Colonel Ernst Weber sits at a wooden table scarred by shrapnel, his Luftwaffe uniform stripped of its insignia, staring at a single sheet of paper that trembles in his hands. The numbers printed on it seem impossible, absurd, a mathematical error that cannot be reconciled with reality. 47,000 fighter aircraft produced by the United States in 1944 alone. More than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. More than the Reich had built in the entire war. His lips move silently, recalculating, searching for the mistake that must exist. But there is no mistake. Only the cold arithmetic of industrial annihilation. The document before Weber is not propaganda. It is an intelligence summary compiled by the Strategic Bombing Survey, corroborated by captured German records, cross-referenced with production manifests from Wichita, Seattle, Long Beach, and 100 other American cities whose names he barely recognizes. The paper is stamped with the eagle of the United States Army Air Forces, and beneath that eagle lies the systematic dismantling of everything the Luftwaffe had believed about its enemy. Weber had flown against the Americans over the Channel in 1943. He had watched their formations darken the sky like migrating birds, endless and inevitable. But he had told himself it was temporary, that American industrial capacity was exaggerated by British propaganda, that no nation could sustain such losses and continue to multiply. He had been wrong about everything. Germany had entered this war with certainty forged in the foundries of the Ruhr, in the precision workshops of Regensburg and Wiener Neustadt. The Luftwaffe was the most modern, most technically advanced air force the world had ever seen. The Bf-109, the Fw-190, the Me-262 jet fighter in its final desperate incarnation. These were aircraft designed by engineers who understood the physics of speed and altitude, who had pioneered dive bombing and fighter tactics that rewrote military doctrine. German industry was efficient, disciplined, organized according to principles that maximized output while minimizing waste. This was the German way, the scientific approach that had transformed a defeated nation in 1918 into a continental power by 1939. And yet here in this simple intelligence summary was proof that science and discipline meant nothing against the raw, almost incomprehensible scale of American production. The numbers scrolled through Weber's mind like a death sentence. In 1943, the United States produced 85,898 aircraft of all types. Germany produced 24,807. In 1944, as the Reich mobilized every resource, conscripted every worker, scattered its factories into caves and forests to escape Allied bombing, German production reached 39,807 aircraft. That same year, America built 96,318. Not just fighters and bombers, but transports, trainers, reconnaissance aircraft, gliders, everything the modern air war demanded. And these were not crude machines rushed from assembly lines with indifference to quality. They were P-51 Mustangs with Rolls-Royce Merlin engines that could escort bombers to Berlin and back. They were B-17 Flying Fortresses armored like battleships, bristling with defensive guns, capable of absorbing punishment that would disintegrate a German bomber. They were P-47 Thunderbolts so heavily built that pilots called them jugs, aircraft that could survive flak damage that would doom any Luftwaffe fighter. Weber had studied the enemy, as any professional officer must. He knew that America had steel, had aluminum, had oil in quantities that Germany could only dream of. But he had assumed that material abundance meant nothing without the martial spirit, the willingness to sacrifice, the ideological commitment that animated the Reich. Americans were soft, individualistic, obsessed with comfort and consumer goods. They lacked the Prussian discipline, the warrior ethos that had defined German military culture for centuries. How could such a people sustain the sacrifices necessary for total war? How could they transform their factories from producing automobiles and refrigerators to producing instruments of death at a scale that eclipsed the combined output of three empires? The answer lay not in ideology, but in something far more fundamental. It lay in the very nature of American industrial capitalism, in the economic system that German theorists had dismissed as decadent and inefficient. Before the war, in the 1930s, American factories had produced more automobiles in a single year than Germany had produced in a decade. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, these corporations had master mass production techniques that made German manufacturing look artisanal by comparison. The assembly line, pioneered by Henry Ford, had revolutionized industrial output, creating a system where unskilled workers could produce complex machinery at unprecedented speed. When war came, these same factories did not need to be rebuilt or reconfigured. They simply changed what rolled off the line. Bomber plants in Willow Run, Michigan, produced B-24 Liberators using the same techniques Ford had used to build cars. One bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. A rate that seemed physically impossible until American engineers proved it wasn't. But production was only part of the equation. The United States possessed something equally important, a resource base that was effectively unlimited. The bauxite mines of Arkansas fed aluminum smelters powered by hydroelectric dams built during the Depression. The oil fields of Texas and Oklahoma produced more petroleum than Germany could extract from Ploesti, the synthetic fuel plants in the Ruhr, and every captured field in the Soviet Union combined. Rubber plantations in Brazil and synthetic rubber plants in Ohio ensured that tire production never faltered. Iron ore from Minnesota, copper from Arizona, tungsten from Colorado, America sat atop a mineral wealth that made autarky not just possible but effortless. Germany had spent the entire war scrambling for resources, trading, conquering, substituting inferior materials when the real thing ran short. America simply had everything, and in quantities so vast that rationing was more about public morale than actual scarcity. Weber remembered the briefings from 1942 when the Luftwaffe High Command had assured its officers that American industry was a paper tiger. Yes, the Americans had factories, but they lacked the technical expertise to produce truly advanced aircraft. Their engines were unreliable, their airframes poorly designed, their pilots undertrained. The first American daylight raids over France had seemed to confirm this assessment. B-17s flying without fighter escort were slaughtered by German fighters. Formations were broken, bombers crashed into the channel, and the survivors limp home with dead crewmen and shattered fuselages. Luftwaffe aces like Egon Mayer and George Peter Eder developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the B-17's vulnerabilities, attacking from head-on where the bomber's defensive armament was weakest. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that American air power could be contained, that losses would force the enemy to abandon daylight strategic bombing altogether. Then came the P-51 Mustang, and everything changed. The Mustang was not a German design. It was American in conception, British in refinement, powered by a British engine built under license in America. It possessed a range that no fighter in the world could match, capable of escorting bombers all the way to targets deep in the Reich, and still having fuel for the return journey. Its performance matched or exceeded the best German fighters, and it was produced in numbers that made losses irrelevant. When a P-51 was shot down, two more appeared in its place. When a German pilot bailed out over his own territory, he might survive to fly again. When he was killed, replacing him took months of training that the Reich no longer had time to provide. The mathematics of attrition became inexorable. Germany was trading quality for quantity, and discovering that quantity had a quality all its own. Weber had watched this transformation from the cockpit, and later from command positions where he coordinated defense against the endless daylight raids. In 1943, Luftwaffe fighters could still inflict devastating losses on American bomber formations. By 1944, the Americans flew with impunity, their fighter escorts so numerous that German interceptors were outnumbered before combat even began. The Luftwaffe responded by developing new tactics, jet fighters, rocket-powered interceptors, anything that might restore the balance. But for every innovation Germany produced in handfuls, America countered with thousands of conventional aircraft flown by adequately trained pilots who didn't need to be aces to overwhelm the defense. The war became a matter of simple arithmetic. Germany could not replace its losses. America replaced its losses and then doubled its force structure. The psychological impact of this realization had been profound. German pilots who survived combat against American formations returned with stories that sounded like hallucinations. They described bomber streams so long that they took half an hour to pass overhead, formations so dense that flak bursts disappeared into the mass without apparent effect. They described fighter sweeps by dozens of Mustangs hunting a lone German aircraft, turning the hunter into the hunted. Most devastating of all, they described the moment when radio discipline collapsed and young pilots screamed that they were out of ammunition, out of fuel, out of options, with American fighters still circling above like patient predators. The Luftwaffe had begun the war as an elite force confident in its superiority. By 1945, it was a shattered remnant flying obsolete aircraft against an enemy that seemed capable of infinite regeneration. But it was not just the quantity of aircraft that had broken German confidence. It was the visible evidence of American abundance in every aspect of air operations. When Luftwaffe mechanics salvaged crashed American bombers, they found luxuries that seemed obscene to men fighting on starvation rations. Electric heating systems to keep crews warm at altitude. Oxygen systems with individual regulators for each crew position. Armor plating inches thick, protecting vital areas. Radios that actually worked with crystal-clear reception instead of the static-filled German sets. And inside these aircraft, scattered among the wreckage, were personal effects that revealed another dimension of American wealth. Cigarettes in quantities sufficient for an entire German squadron. Chocolate bars wrapped in foil. Chewing gum. Photographs of homes with automobiles parked outside, 2 or 3 per family. Evidence of a society so rich that even its common soldiers lived better than German officers. The symbolic weight of these discoveries cannot be overstated. National Socialist ideology had taught that the German Volk possessed a racial and spiritual superiority that more than compensated for any material disadvantage. The Spartan discipline of the Wehrmacht was contrasted with the decadence of the democracies, where citizen soldiers lacked the martial virtues necessary for victory. Yet here was tangible proof that material abundance did not produce weakness. American aircrews flew mission after mission into skies where the probability of death or capture approached certainty. They did so without the ideological fervor of National Socialism, motivated instead by a simpler calculus. Duty, comradeship, and the knowledge that their nation's industrial power made their sacrifice meaningful. When a German pilot died, his loss weakened an already depleted force. When an American died, 10 more were training to take his place, flying aircraft that hadn't even been built yet. Weber's hands moved across the intelligence summary, tracing production figures that read like a requiem for the Reich. Boeing, Consolidated, Douglas, Lockheed, North American, Republic, these corporate names meant more than any general strategy. They represented a fusion of capitalism and state power that had created what amounted to an industrial war machine without precedent in human history. The German economy had been organized for war since 1936, with Göring's 4-year plan designed to achieve autarky and prepare for conflict. Yet, at the peak of mobilization, with Albert Speer's rationalization of production yielding impressive gains, Germany could not match what America achieved almost casually. The United States had fought a 2-ocean war, supplying Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, while simultaneously building the most powerful military in the world, and had done so while maintaining civilian living standards that exceeded Germany's peacetime prosperity. The key lay in America's economic model, which German theorists had fundamentally misunderstood. Capitalism was not a weakness to be exploited, but a system optimized for exactly the kind of total mobilization that modern war demanded. American corporations competed for defense contracts, driving innovation and efficiency in ways that the centralized German economy could not replicate. The profit motive, far from being a distraction, aligned private interest with national necessity. When Boeing developed the B-29 Superfortress, it did so not from ideological commitment, but from the knowledge that success meant corporate survival and expansion. That same aircraft, designed to bomb Japan into submission, represented a technological achievement that Germany never approached: a pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, a range of 3,250 miles, and the capacity to carry 20,000 pounds of bombs. One bomber, produced by the thousands. There was also the matter of labor. Germany had relied on slave labor, concentration camp inmates, and prisoners of war forced to work in factories under conditions that guaranteed sabotage and low productivity. America mobilized its workforce through wages, war bonds, and patriotic appeal. Women who had never worked outside the home became riveters, welders, and assembly line workers. Rosie the Riveter was not propaganda, but a reflection of social transformation that unlocked millions of additional workers. These laborers were motivated, trained, and treated as essential contributors to the war effort. They did not sabotage the weapons they built. They took pride in the quality of their work, knowing that their brother, husband, or son might fly the bomber they assembled. This created a feedback loop of quality and morale that the German system, built on coercion and racial hierarchy, could never achieve. The door to the bunker opened and light flooded in. American voices called out in accented German, ordering prisoners to assemble for transport. Weber stood slowly, joints aching from hours at the table, and moved toward the door. He carried nothing but the uniform on his back and the folded intelligence summary in his pocket. Outside, in the ruins of Berlin, the war was over. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist. Germany itself had ceased to exist as anything but an occupied territory divided among the victors. And the lesson, the terrible obvious lesson that German leadership had refused to learn, was written in the production statistics of American factories, that abundance, not austerity, was the foundation of military power in the 20th century. As Weber emerged into daylight, squinting against the brightness, he saw the symbol that had haunted him for 3 years. Overhead, at high altitude, contrails marked the passage of American bombers flying to some target in what remained of the Reich. They flew in perfect formation, unthreatened by German fighters, bombing with impunity because the Luftwaffe no longer existed as a fighting force. Those contrails represented the visible proof of American industrial supremacy. Each bomber was a factory's output, each crew the product of a vast training establishment, each bomb load a fraction of America's seemingly limitless productive capacity. The contrails stretched across the sky like white scars, beautiful and terrible, the signature of a nation that had transformed itself from isolationism to global dominance in less than a decade. Weber had begun this war believing in German exceptionalism, in the idea that superior culture and military tradition would triumph over material disadvantages. He ended it understanding that history belonged to those who could build more aircraft, train more pilots, and sustain longer campaigns than their enemies. Democracy had proven more resilient than dictatorship. Capitalism had proven more efficient than the planned economy of the Reich. And the abundance that National Socialism had dismissed as decadence had been converted into the most formidable military machine in human history. These were uncomfortable truths for a German officer raised on tales of Prussian military genius and racial superiority. But they were truths nonetheless, written in the wreckage of every German city, in the graves of 2 million Luftwaffe personnel, in the intelligence summary that documented America's production of more aircraft than all Axis nations combined. The epilogue of this story extends beyond Weber's personal defeat. It touches something fundamental about the nature of power and freedom in the modern world. The United States had demonstrated that a democratic, capitalist society could mobilize for total war more effectively than totalitarian states. It had done so while preserving civil liberties, maintaining relatively free markets, and allowing citizens to criticize their government. The arsenal of democracy was not just a propaganda slogan, but a description of reality. America's industrial abundance, created by free enterprise and protected by democratic institutions, had proven decisive in the greatest conflict in human history. This was not an accident or a temporary advantage. It reflected deeper truths about the relationship between freedom and prosperity, between political systems and economic performance. The German officer corps had believed that war was about strategy, tactics, and the warrior spirit. They had studied Clausewitz and Moltke, trained in the Prussian tradition, prided themselves on professionalism and martial excellence. Yet they had been defeated by a nation of shopkeepers, farmers, and factory workers who understood that modern war was fundamentally industrial. The Americans did not need to be better soldiers than Germans, though by wars, and many were. They needed only to produce more weapons, train more personnel, and sustain operations longer than the enemy. This they did with an efficiency that made German mobilization look amateur by comparison. And so the contrails across the Berlin sky became a symbol of transformation, of the moment when one vision of power was replaced by another. The Reich had promised a new order built on racial hierarchy and military conquest. America had offered abundance, democracy, and the promise that free peoples could defend themselves against tyranny. History had rendered its verdict. The regime that built Dachau and Auschwitz, that started a war of annihilation against its neighbors, that promised 1,000 years of dominance, had lasted barely 12. The democracy that had seemed weak and divided in the 1930s had become the world's dominant power, not through superior brutality, but through superior production, not through better ideology, but through better economics. Weber understood this now, standing in the ruins of his nation's capital, watching American bombers cross the sky. The numbers in the intelligence summary were not just statistics, but a requiem for everything he had believed. Germany had produced 119,000 aircraft during the entire war. America had produced 324,750. This numerical superiority, multiplied across every category of military equipment, had determined the outcome before the first shot was fired. The tragedy was that German leaders had known, or should have known, that such a disparity made victory impossible. But ideology, pride, and the intoxication of early success had blinded them to economic reality. They had gambled that speed would compensate for weakness, that blitzkrieg would deliver victory before America's industrial might could be mobilized. They had lost that gamble, and the price was paid not just by soldiers like Weber, but by millions of civilians, by entire cities reduced to rubble, by civilization's utter destruction. In the end, the story of German officers staring in disbelief at American production figures is not just about aviation or military history. It is about the collision between ideology and reality, between romantic notions of warfare and the industrial logic of 20th century conflict. It is about the discovery that abundance, not austerity, was the key to military power. It is about the realization that a free society, properly mobilized, could outproduce and outlast a totalitarian state. These lessons would shape the post-war world, informing American strategy during the Cold War and beyond. The arsenal of democracy had proven its worth, not through propaganda, but through the cold mathematics of production. 96,318 aircraft in 1944 alone, more than all Axis nations combined, more than enough to turn the tide of history itself.